Hello, I am Crystal.
I'm Hannah Neal.
And welcome to Season 5 of the EV Life podcast.
Yeah, we have another amazing season lineup of topics for you. You might be wondering if you've been listening to EV Life for a while, what are you talking about this season? Well, as you guys know, the EV industry is always evolving. There's always new developments and new information that comes out on, sometimes a weekly basis, a monthly basis. So we do have some really exciting topics that are relevant to you, our listeners. Maybe you're considering an EV or maybe you already own one. But we're really looking forward to sharing that information and continuing to be a source of reliable information for you.
And speaking of new topics, we were joined today by Chris Travell from Ipsos, and he was here to talk about a recent study that they did on emerging trends in the automotive industry. And of course, our focus was on electric vehicles.
Yeah, so Chris talks, about the study. It's been running for a long time, and there's some trends that are maybe not a shock to you, or might be a shock to you. And he kind of dives into those a little bit. And yeah, was there anything from the episode that stood out to you?
Yeah, we talked about, I guess, the downward trend in consumers adopting electric vehicles. And he talked about some of the reasons why that is and some of the considerations that people have to make when, considering buying an electric vehicle. And one of the things that came up, particularly for people living in the prairies, is range anxiety and range loss in wintertime, which I thought was really interesting because if you are subscribed to the podcast, you'll know that we released a bonus episode between season 4 and the launch of season 5 all about that.
Yeah, that was a really interesting episode. If you didn't have the chance to watch it yet, we encourage you to head over to our YouTube channel. We'll link everything in the show description so you can easily access it. But yeah, Crystal had the chance to actually travel over to Ottawa and Quebec and be a part of this study that, looked at what winter performance was for EVs.
Yeah, it's unlike any episode we've done for the podcast. So I'd really encourage you to check that out. And really at the heart of this, we were addressing how much range do some of the most popular electric vehicles on the market today in Canada actually lose in extreme cold temperatures. And so I got to be a part of that. We took a bunch of cars from Ottawa to Mont-Tremblant in Quebec, and we basically drove these cars until the batteries completely died. So a unique experience. And then we also tested once the batteries were at 0, how long did it take for it to charge up to 10% and then from 10% to 80%. So, when that comes up in today's interview, I'd recommend also going and checking out that episode. So hopefully we can address that concern for people.
Yeah, and we'll also link the slides to the study that Chris is talking about. And so you can see for yourself what the EV trend, 2025 EV adoption trends are in Canada. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, with all of that, let's take a listen to my interview with Chris Travell from Ipsos. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me, Crystal. Very much appreciate you making the call and having this conversation. So thank you.
Can we start off by just you sharing with our audience who you are and what your role is?
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. Chris Travell, Senior Vice President of the NVCS group within Ipsos. And as far as what that is, most listeners may know Ipsos from the polling work we do, and obviously that's going to be stepping up in the next few months. But we work basically with all clients in Canada and in fact around the world. So that could be financial, it could be health sciences, it could be brand tracking. I'm in the automotive industry and started there in 1986 and been associated with a study that we're going to be talking about today since 1996. So have a little bit of history there.
Yeah, and you're here to tell us a little bit about some key trends, particularly as it pertains to EV adoption in Canada. So can you start by just letting us know what some of these trends that you're noticing over at Ipsos are?
Well, I think there's a number, Crystal, which are noteworthy. And just so the audience knows where I'm pulling the data from here on this one, the new vehicle customer study, which is the source of this information, it is the largest automotive study in Canada and also the longest running. So it's been running since 1981. So we have some pretty good trending there that we can draw upon. And specifically as it relates to EVs, one of the things which has been happening over the last number of years, but it has been accelerating, is what we call consideration. So consideration is when you come into the market last year in 2024, as an example, how many consumers considered electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles when they were making their purchase. And what we found was it was going up until about 2022, but then consideration has decreased, and it's decreased in three areas. We track hybrid vehicles, so think of like a Toyota Prius, that kind of example, but many manufacturers have a hybrid powertrain. Plug-in hybrid vehicles, so ones that you actually plug in to get to charge the engine, and then battery electric vehicles. So basically, they run completely on a battery. And the important thing is, and that term we saw, one of the big ones, was that has been dipping since 2022. So consideration for those three different types of powertrains has been slipping, and that's not just a Canadian trend that we see, but it also is very evident when we look at BC and the Prairie provinces as well. So a general trend at the macro level, but on the more micro level, when we look at Western Canada, that consideration trend is there, and certainly a lot of manufacturers are concerned about that right now.
And do you know what's causing that downward trend?
Well, there are a couple matters at hand here. The peak in 2022, if listeners and watchers can refer back and think back to that time, gas prices were a little higher in Canada than what they are now. So therefore, considering those other powertrains, be it hybrid or plug-in or battery electric vehicles, it became a choice that consumers were at least willing to consider. So the fact it's dropped now, maybe not it's understandable. But the other thing is to keep in mind is that there are other issues that have been that customers are thinking about now, not the least of which, for example, is range anxiety. That's one of the big things. You don't want to be stuck in an electric vehicle driving from Edmonton out to Winnipeg. So certainly in that particular case, range anxiety is an issue and has been a barrier to entry. But the other thing is such things as charging infrastructure as well. If the infrastructure isn't there for a customer to charge their vehicle, then of course that is going to hinder adoption as well. So those types of things, and also let's be honest, just from a wallet standpoint, electric vehicles are more expensive. So as affordability in Canada becomes a little bit more of an issue, then that is going to enter into the purchase decision for a customer. So all three of those things in particular, I think, are really important to try and understand why consideration may be dropping.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, those aren't for our listeners in particularly. I don't think that those causes would be a shock to them as to why maybe people aren't considering purchasing an EV or a hybrid. But are there any subtle barriers that consumers face when considering EV adoption that maybe just aren't as obvious as, range anxiety and charging infrastructure?
The one that I think is especially pertinent to Western Canada, and it made the headlines in this past winter, is the cold weather capability of electric vehicles. And yes, the range does drop when it gets colder. So therefore, in some pretty high-profile cases that made the news where customers were stranded, and that obviously is not a good situation because they ran out of juice in their vehicle. So that's not a good situation, and the press picks up on that. So that is a subtle thing that doesn't happen in all cases, but obviously in Western Canada, that is a bit of a concern just because of the climate and the geography associated with that part of the country.
I guess that is a big one for Western Canada in particular because it does, we have really cold weather. Were there
Yes.
other things that were specific to the prairies that you're seeing causing some of these downward trends?
Generally, what we find, Crystals, across the country, it's pretty similar. So one other one that has come up, which is also prevalent in Western Canada, when we take a look at charging infrastructure as an example, the time to charge for customers is an issue as well. So not only just the availability of charging stations across the country and in Western Canada, but also once a customer locates those charging stations, how long it actually takes them to actually charge. When we do get feedback from customers that even sometimes, not always, clearly, but sometimes when they are actually able to locate a charging station, it's not working for whatever reason. Well, obviously, that's not a great situation for anybody, and that can happen as well. But generally, it's pretty similar across the country what customers are expressing to us as far as the concerns they have with electric vehicles right now.
Yeah. Was there anything surprising or unexpected from the study?
I think there are a number of things. First of all, I mean, the consideration dropping was, as it continues to drop, was a surprise. The reason I say that is because, as the listeners know, there's a lot of good product out there that are EVs, and many manufacturers are bringing product to market that is a good product. It's fairly priced for what the customer is getting, but also it's a situation where you would have expected consideration to at least be higher than what it was because the product is good. Now, I can also tell you in talking to contacts in the industry, they're already working on 2030 product plans, and a large component of that is going to be is EV focused. Now, the dark horse in this, and what we're not sure about, obviously, is in view of the uncertainty of what's going on right now with the tariff situation and what's going on south of the border as far as the overall automotive strategy. But consideration may drop if indeed there's less emphasis from a North American perspective on EVs. So that's kind of something to kind of keep in mind. But other things, the one thing we did find was that when we asked customers when they bought their gas-powered vehicle or their hybrid vehicle or their plug-in or whatever, what else what you would have considered? And I want to focus in specifically on gas-powered or ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles right now. What was surprising was when someone bought a gas-powered vehicle, there was extremely little consideration of an electric vehicle. So, for example, if someone bought a gas-powered vehicle, only about 3.7% of those customers considered another type of vehicle other than a gas-powered vehicle. So that you look at that and think, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is a lot of the electric vehicle buyers who have come to market, those are the early adopters, and they've come in, they've acquired the vehicle, and they're enjoying their vehicle right now. But from a sales standpoint for the manufacturers, they obviously want to get those customers who are driving gas-powered vehicles into an electric vehicle, if indeed that's what they want to do, and that's typically the strategy. And especially for the mandates across Canada, you want to do that. But the surprise was that so little or so few of those gas-powered vehicle customers considered electric vehicles, and that has implications from a sales standpoint for the manufacturers, but also from a mandate perspective for the governments across Canada, which has to be considered as well. The consumer demand wasn't as much there as we would have expected. So certainly that in particular was a finding that really kind of jumped out at us.
That is actually surprising to hear, and one I don't know if I thought about before, but that's quite interesting. So I imagine from the OEM perspective, there's a lot of, I guess, awareness that they're going to have to get out there for new consumers looking to purchase a car if they want an increase in customers buying EVs versus their ICE vehicles.
And that is spot on, Crystal. I think what's interesting, though, that what the data told us was that if we can get customers into a hybrid vehicle, for example, which is a good substitute for that, if we can get them into a hybrid vehicle, there's a greater consideration of both a plug-in hybrid as well as a full battery electric vehicle. The percentage of customers considering those options jumps a lot. Then if we can get customers into a PHEV, the consideration of a full electric vehicle jumps up again by a pretty substantial amount. So it's almost like a hybrid, the hybrid technology, it's almost like a gateway technology, if we want to call it that, into those other types of powertrains. And I think that's a kind of a really noteworthy thing. So from an OEM perspective, from a manufacturer perspective, it's not too surprising when we take a look at the sales mix of, for example, a company like Toyota, and that's only one of many. But because so much of their product line is now available in hybrid, you can see why they've had the success they've had from a sales standpoint, because they're giving the customers options to go into not just hybrid, but the other powertrains that they have available. So it's certainly a really interesting time right now in the market.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. And so, for people considering an EV, like you mentioned, there are a lot of considerations. And so do you know where buyers are turning to help get this information and help inform their decisions?
Yes, we do. And that's a really interesting dynamic going on in the marketplace. And the reason I say that is what we found is a combination of online sources, as you might expect, but also, and not arguably more important, is we find that the salesperson at the dealership is the number two most important reason as to why the customer bought the EV they did. And the reason that's important and interesting is there are some pundits who have said that, well, basically, you know what? We don't need salespeople anymore. They're just a thing of the past. We can just call Amazon, and lo and behold, the package or the car shows up in our driveway the next day. Well, you know what? Customers aren't telling us that. The market doesn't support, the data doesn't tell us that story, but rather what it is telling us is that salespeople indeed are very valued sources of information to a customer in basically learning about the expensive purchase that they're about to make. And when you think of that, it's not, perhaps not too surprising, because first of all, it is an expensive purchase, but also the fact that we got to remember, for the lion's share of the market in Canada, electric vehicles it's still new technology. So customers want to learn about that. Yes, they can learn online, and indeed that's the number one source, as you might imagine. But knowing what customers are looking at and learning about on different websites, they need to basically bring that home from how that's going to affect them in their day-to-day life. And that's where the role of the salesperson comes in. So I would argue, and the data would suggest, that the role of the salesperson is absolutely critical. So basically, those manufacturers who are saying that we can do away with salespeople when electric vehicles come on board, man, that's not a wise course of action, because the data just don't support it. So certainly the human touch and the information which salespeople can provide to potential customers for EVs, absolutely critical. Do not dispense with that.
That is pretty interesting information. And also, I'm sure a lot of dealerships and salespeople are happy to hear that, right? But it makes sense
for sure.
When you do all the research, when you go into the dealership to buy the car, you get confidence from the salesperson, right? As them sort of reassuring you that this is kind of the right purchase to make. So that's definitely insightful to hear.
Yeah. And the other thing, Crystal, if this helps the listeners and so on, or anyone considering an EV, exactly what you just said there, but kind of building on it a little bit post-purchase. What I mean by that, anytime a customer buys a car, especially if they're spending, $50,000, $60,000 for an electric vehicle and up, there's always the potential of cognitive dissonance. So buyer's remorse. So did I make the right decision in buying that electric vehicle? And I think not only pre-purchase for the salespeople, but post-purchase, there is a role for salespeople and the dealership to play. And what I mean by that is, when somebody, when the bloom is still on the rose when they pick up the car, right? So when they drive it home, they're going to have lots and lots of questions after a few weeks, charging questions, infrastructure questions, whatever it is. And where the salesperson can play a role in is to knowing that dynamic is going to happen, is to play the role of providing further education to the customer during the course of the ownership experience. And I think for OEMs, that's a real opportunity for them to be able to provide that information. So they almost become an educational hub for customers, to allow them to learn about electric vehicles, but also how they can use the electric vehicles that they have just acquired to a much greater extent than they would have expected. So certainly there's a role there, pre-purchase as well as post-purchase.
So you've been with Ipsos for quite a while, as you mentioned early in the interview. And this study has been around since the early 80s. So how do you see, just with all of the knowledge that you have from, participating in these studies, how do you see these trends shifting and evolving in the next few years?
I think as it relates to EVs, I think there are a number of things. As I mentioned, we're watching obviously what's going on south of the border very closely, as the manufacturers are as well, because we don't know, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. I think what's going to happen from a trend standpoint, depending on what happens in April and onward, I think the sales mix of manufacturers is going to change. So whereas it may have been more emphasis on EVs when manufacturers are planning going forward, that may change a little bit. So we may move a little bit more back to ICE vehicles before it moves forward into EVs. So that's certainly a trend which we're looking at. But also from a technology standpoint, one of the trends that we're obviously watching, as many are, is battery technology. I mean, solid state batteries are coming, but depending on who you read, they're a ways away yet. But that is the potential of being a real game changer, which I think is important. So there's two there. But the third one also, just from a customer experience standpoint, is home charging, I think, is going to be evolving as well. And again, what I mean by that is right now, customers are telling us about, and last year when we did the survey, I should mention, NVCS is the biggest automotive study in Canada. So it's about 100,000 we got feedback from last year. And one thing we found was that home charging, about 50% of customers said they couldn't charge because it wasn't available at their home for whatever reason. So therefore, I think there's greater development that is going to happen, it has to happen, as it relates to home charging, getting folks hooked up with level 2 chargers so they can quickly and efficiently charge their electric vehicle. And that's one area in particular which I think there's growth, and one that from a trend standpoint, we're going to see changes in that, because there has to be that happening so that customers can actually charge their vehicle and actually use it day to day for getting groceries and so on. So those three areas in particular are areas that we're looking at.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You shared some really incredible insights for myself and also our listeners on these trends that we're seeing in the automotive industry. And we'll link to the study that we've referenced in this interview. So if our listeners would like to access that, they can.
That would be great. Well, thanks very much, Crystal, and thank you for your interest in the subject. It's obviously a hugely topical right now, not just here in Canada, but around the world. So appreciate sharing some insights with you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the EV Life podcast. Make sure that you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you'd like to join the conversation, you can always do so in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. We'll talk to you in the next episode.